Thank you. Thank you, Alejandra. Thank you to Fasicolda for inviting me here. I think there's a lot of reasons to be thankful for being here in Colombia. Personally, I have had, whether it's on a personal basis or professional basis, at the UN and Switzerland.
Es un pueblo muy hospitalario, un maravilloso país, buena comida, buen café, así que es todo un placer estar de regreso en Colombia. Revisé el convenio que se me dio y estaba firmado, tenía que asegurarme que sí estuviera firmado por el doctor Botero y vi que sí, con gran alegría, así que espero que en algún punto, en los próximos meses o inclusive el próximo año, podamos mirar y acordarnos de este día hoy en Bogotá y poder decir, este fue el comienzo de una nueva era para la industria colombiana de seguros en cuanto al desarrollo sostenible. Todo este programa
Framed as a seminar. For me, it works both ways. One purpose is to share with you what the different speakers and myself know about insurance and sustainable development. The other reason that I'm here is to learn from you, to understand what Colombia is doing, what the insurance industry is doing in the areas of sustainable development and the insurance business. I was struck with a few points, with some of the few points that Dr. Botero had mentioned earlier, and some of those thoughts that he mentioned resonate very much with the idea of insurance and sustainable development. One is quality of life. Ultimately, implementing those sustainable development goals mean that we want a better quality of life, not just for a few people, but for all. The other one is good practice. The principles themselves are a framework for implementation, and I think Dr. Botero had mentioned that one of the key things going forward is how do we actually adopt these principles and implement them in our day-to-day business. And then he also mentioned a very important element of time horizon. He mentioned the problem of short-sightedness. I think when you think about sustainability issues and sustainable development, we are inevitably caught in an issue of how do we balance short-term and long-term. So I think the element of time horizon is very important. But let me add a few things also that I think are very important. I think by having an event like this here, by Fasicolda joining the PSI, and by you being here, you are expressing leadership. Leadership is important in driving the sustainable development agenda. This is not only an agenda that's forced upon governments or private sector, but an agenda that we hope everyone can embrace. That's why Juan Pablo's presentation on sustainable development goals is very important, because these goals are not just goals for governments. It's a goal for every one of us, for business, for civil society, for all levels of government, and for each one of us, and for insurance companies as well. So the more we are familiar with these goals, the better it is that we know how we can contribute to it. The last reflection, initial reflection, based on what I've already learned in the first few hours of this seminar, is we need to understand that for Colombia, this discussion is definitely a national discussion. But Colombia is also part of a global community of nations. So you also have an international role. So the question also for Colombia is that how will you translate these principles not only in a national context, but what is your role in the international space in terms of promoting sustainable development? So I hope with those few thoughts, I'm quite happy to be here and share some initial reflections. I'm now going to give you a more fuller presentation of what the principles for sustainable insurance is all about. So let me start by saying that, excuse me, from the United Nations perspective, the role of the insurance industry in sustainable development is not just relegated to one particular role. It's three roles. The first role that many people are familiar with for insurance is the role of the insurance industry as risk carriers. This is when things go wrong, when there are fortuitous events that happen, that insurance companies are there to pay for losses and provide financial protection and financial resilience. That is what a lot of people know with the insurance industry. What other people do not know is that the insurance industry is one of the largest investors in the world. Globally, the industry holds around $29 trillion in assets under management. That's a really big amount. In the UN climate change negotiations, governments are trying to agree on a $100 billion goal by 2020. The insurance industry has 29 trillion. And let's not kid ourselves. If we want to address global climate change, both adaptation and mitigation, we need to think trillions, not just billions. And finally, I think one of the most important elements and roles of the insurance industry is the role as a risk manager. Insurance is premised on the business of managing risk. So risk that's identified, that's quantified, that's prevented and reduced, it's part and parcel of the insurance risk management value chain. And that, for us, is a very strong skill set of the insurance industry that could be shared and deployed, not only with governments, but also with other parts of society. The work of the United Nations with the insurance industry has led to a lot of global research in the past few years. Not only, and we've identified quite a number of key issues in many years of work. We've interviewed, we've surveyed CEOs around the world of insurance companies, chief underwriting officers, chief investment officers, and chief risk officers, and I've summarized here in many ways what are some of the key environmental, social, and governance risks and opportunities that insurers around the world have identified. Let me start by showing, for example, the environmental dimension. The issue on environmental risk is not only a climate change issue. We are living on a planet that is sick and that has already been breaching thresholds. Take the case of biodiversity loss worldwide. We are already seeing species become extinct. Land use is another threshold through massive deforestation worldwide that we are seeing, as well as the nitrogen phosphorus cycle. We have over-fertilized our lands, and that has led to tipping points already being breached as well. So, and there are many other issues. For example, chemical pollution is an issue, as an environmental issue. It's also a human health issue. And if you look at the insurance industry globally, one of the most bitter lessons for the insurance industry globally is the problem of asbestos liability, where the human impacts of asbestos were underestimated originally, but has led to billions and dollars of cumulative losses in the insurance industry spanning many decades. So definitely the environment is changing, and there is a need to understand that changing risk landscape. And if you look at disasters and vulnerability around the world, it's not surprising that most of the global south are the most vulnerable to disasters and also issues like climate change. The other interesting element is that the most vulnerable are also the least protected. So I think it was already mentioned, for example, the case of access to insurance, inclusive insurance, microinsurance, are all part of the sustainability agenda. So we need to make sure that we address that issue. Swiss Re had identified that globally there is a massive insurance protection gap. Economic losses are growing, but there's a big gap between economic losses and insured losses. So last year, the protection gap was estimated to be $75 billion. So we need to close that gap. In UNEP, we also undertook a global initiative where we studied financial policy and regulation around the world, the role of central banks, the role of insurance regulators, banking regulators, and securities regulators. And in the report on insurance, one of the key priorities identified globally is to close that protection gap. On trust and reputation, this is a survey that has been done internationally for the past 5 years or so. And you can see that among different industry sectors, the technology sector is one of the most trusted sectors worldwide. But look at where financial services and banks are. It's the bottom of the pile. And this may or may not have been partly influenced by the global financial crisis, but wherever we go, in terms of not just a survey, but also if you talk to people, the trust and reputation in terms of the financial sector, including the insurance industry, there is a trust gap out there. It's one of those things that we also want to close. And this is the reason why the UN, together with the insurance industry, developed a set of principles for sustainable insurance to understand what is the role of the insurance industry in sustainable development, what is the role of the insurance industry in promoting economic, social, and environmental sustainability. Because sustainable development should not be viewed from a very specific dimension of economic sustainability only. The basic premise of sustainable development is that the economic, social, and environmental dimensions of development are mutually reinforcing. And in these principles, we wanted to understand how the insurance industry could play a role in fulfilling sustainable development. So take the example of Principle 1. Principle 1 is about how you embed sustainability issues in your core business. If you are an insurance company, how do you set your strategy? How do you underwrite business? How do you manage claims? And how do you invest? Principle 2 is about the insurance industry value chain. How do you address environmental, social, and governance issues with your clients, with your suppliers, with your reinsurer if you are an insurance company, with your insurance broker, with your reinsurance broker, etc. Because the whole value chain has to be aligned. Principle 3 is a recognition that no one company can do this on its own. In fact, not even the entire insurance industry can address many of the sustainable development challenges. So Principle 3 is a recognition that to drive this agenda, there is a need to work with governments, there is a need to work with regulators, and there's a need to work with civil society and other sectors, key stakeholders in society. Principle 4 is about accountability and transparency. Public accountability and transparency is not only an issue that's only for governments, it's also for business. We didn't want to create a statement of good intentions. We wanted to make sure that these principles are implemented, that there is a public accountability and transparency mechanism as far as the principles are concerned. So in 2012, the principles were launched at the UN Conference on Sustainable Development, and we were very pleased that the Secretary General endorsed the principles. It's not every day that you can ask the Secretary General to endorse something, to endorse not only for governments, something for governments, but also for business. It's even more rare to ask him to endorse a set of principles for the insurance industry. But he did that. He did that in 2012, and we launched the principles at the UN Conference on Sustainable Development in Rio de Janeiro. It was an example of leadership from the insurance industry, from the private sector, that has still resonated across the UN system since then. Since then, we have tripled the membership of the PSI in terms of companies, but also insurance associations. I'm very happy that we have added another insurance association today, but also insurance regulators, Also think tanks and even environmental organizations out there. Just recently, the International Actuarial Association signed the PSI. The African Risk Capacity also just signed the PSI. And you have regulators from California, from Washington State, the Philippines also joining the PSI. So there is a lot of originally members from Europe. Brazil has been such a leader and such an inspiration for the PSI, launching the principles there. And I'm quite happy that after this session, I can add another dot in Latin America and have Colombia there. I think our goal is to make sure that we cannot see Colombia on the map anymore after a few years. So what have we achieved? As a set of principles, the principles have already been recognized by the Dow Jones Sustainability Indices, also by the FTSE4Good. Brazil has a corporate sustainability index, and they have also included the principles as a criteria for the insurance industry in that index. When the principles were launched in 2012, Interbrand, which ranks the top 100 corporate brands in the world, recognized the principles. They identified AXA as the #1 insurance brand globally. And if you read the first sentence, it says, AXA and 26 other companies signed the principles for sustainable insurance. And of course, the mandatory and annual public disclosure of the principles. Every company that signs the principles has to publicly disclose how it's implementing the principles. It's a sign of transparency and accountability. The smart companies also use it as a best tool, as a tool to communicate to their stakeholders. This is how we as a company are contributing to the sustainable development agenda. So individually, what have we seen? I'm only going to cite a few examples of practices by some of the leading companies out there that we thought to be very innovative. Swiss Re is the first company to come out publicly with a framework on sustainability that they apply not only for their insurance and reinsurance business, but also for the investment transactions. They've identified different sectors where they want to underwrite environmental, social, and governance risks in a more diligent way, and they've used the PSI and the Principle 1 as a way to implement this framework. Since then, other companies have joined, have created a framework like that, Munich Re, AXA, Allianz as well. Some of the global companies have started, but let me assure you, it's not only for global companies. We have companies in China, for example, who have a similar framework, not only for insurance, but also for reinsurance. So this is something that can be done by companies who have a national mandate, but also an international operations. Munich Re as a company, one of the highlights for me last year was we were in Geneva, and the chief engineering underwriter of Munich Re was with us. And he said, Butch, we have created an ESG tool for underwriting engineering insurance based on the PSI. So this is something that did not happen overnight. And if you have the chief engineering underwriter of the world's largest reinsurance company talking to you about sustainable insurance and talking to you about environmental and social governance issues, that for me brings the principles to the heart of core business. And I tested that underwriter. A few weeks after, I was in South Africa, and I spoke with the Munich Re engineering underwriter in Africa, and they are also aware of this tool. So I think that is a sign of integration that is very clear. Last May in Paris, the group CEO of AXA announced very important initiatives from AXA. They decided to divest from coal to the tune of around 500 million euros. They joined the African Risk Capacity to provide risk protection for vulnerable countries in Africa. And they also committed to triple their green investment by 2020. These are, for many companies, their way of expressing their commitment to the principles. But at the very heart of the PSI is not only individual action, it's also collaborative action. I think Dr. Botero had mentioned earlier how the issue of how a market can come together and actually address collective challenges, for example, perhaps like climate change or perhaps natural disasters. Within the PSI, the insurance companies that have supported the PSI have agreed that one of the key issues for collaboration is how they can all work together in building disaster resilience. So take the case of natural disasters worldwide, 190 billion economic losses every year, only around 60 billion are insured, 1 million people have already died this century due to disasters, but there's a big but out there. If you look at governments around the world, a lot of the funding is actually by governments is actually focused on disaster relief and recovery instead of preventive measures that actually reduce disaster risk. So that is a big issue around the world. And for us, the scenario is simple. You can, as an insurer, insure anything that you can price. The problem is that with issues like rapid urbanization, population growth, climate change, to what extent will that price be affordable in the long term? So if you have increasing disaster risk, there is a consequence on the price of insurance and the affordability of insurance. So for us, if we are able to work with governments and other key stakeholders in reducing disaster risk, we can also make insurance more accessible and more affordable, not only for traditional insurance, but also micro-insurance solutions and also solutions at the sovereign level. So what have we done in the PSI, led by Insurance Australia Group and working with different insurance companies around the world? Last year, we did a global study on what are the most effective measures to reduce natural disasters, whether it's a behavioral measure, a structural measure, or in terms of natural ecosystems. And we found out that across cyclones, floods, and earthquake, education and communication globally is very important. Risk mapping, which is a key asset of the insurance industry, is very important as well. And early warning and evacuation. I come from the Philippines, so a few years ago we had a bitter experience in Super Typhoon Haiyan, where almost more than 7,000 people had died. Just this week we had another big typhoon in the Philippines, but we've learned our lesson from Typhoon Haiyan. I think there were still sadly a few people who died, but definitely not even the hundreds and definitely not in the thousands. So early warning and evacuation is key to building resilience. And across the individual hazards, we found out that beyond man-made measures like seawalls, ecosystems like sand dunes and mangroves are also effective in reducing disaster risk. For flood, not only floodgates, but also proper land use planning and wetlands. Earthquake, no surprise, building codes, retrofitting, and relocation. We also, as collectively, the PSI membership, led by Insurance Australia Group, decided that we need to be able to communicate that the value of insurance is not only insurance as a financial instrument, but the value of managing risk and communicating that risk to stakeholders. So we developed a publicly accessible global risk map that shows exposure, vulnerability, and hazards around the world. It also shows the Human Development Index. It also shows insurance penetration and density. It's our way of communicating to different stakeholders that the value of the insurance industry expands beyond risk transfer, but it's also really about understanding risk and managing risk. And lastly, this project is meant to drive country initiatives In Australia, we have already the Australian Business Roundtable for Disaster Resilience and Safer Communities, led by an insurance company, but working with banks, working with the Red Cross, working with other parts of business. In Canada, we have a flood resilience initiative that came out of this PSI Global Resilience Project. In Africa, we're starting next year an initiative working at resilience at the level of cities. We've already identified the first city, Dar es Salaam, in Tanzania, as a pilot project. So what is the end goal? And one of the key things that we wanted to share was that in Australia, the reason why an insurance company came out and said, we need to change things is because the government was allocating 10 times more money on disaster relief and recovery compared to disaster risk reduction. But through the Australian Business Roundtable, the engagement of the insurance industry, that funding of 50 million, there is now a proposal to increase it to 200 million Australian dollars every year. And that for us is a national example of how an insurance company can drive leadership. And if that could happen in Australia, our question was that, can that not happen in other countries? Can that happen in Colombia, in Brazil, in Canada, in the Philippines? Why not? Next week, I will be in AXA, where the CEO of AXA will launch this global report that we've done. It will show how cities around the world and SMEs are addressing or adapting to climate change. It's the first survey of its kind. Sadly, I cannot share with you the results, but in just 1 week, you'll get the results. And this is an example of how an insurance company, through the PSI, working with Ingle, the Global Cities Network, can actually drive change out there in terms of what is the role of the insurance industry in helping cities and SMEs out there in managing climate risk. And if you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, there are very specific goals on the role of cities and building sustainable and resilient cities, for example. What are other things that we're doing? Munich Re, together with the World Bank, Allianz, and other companies, we are now doing a survey of how insurance companies who write surety bonds for infrastructure projects are factoring in environmental, social, and governance issues, whether that project leads to environmental pollution, to what extent does a project dislocate local communities, and to what extent that project may have corruption implications as well. So this is an ongoing survey that we're doing. Next year, we will come up with guiding principles for surety bonds on how sustainability issues for this particular class of business can be achieved. And if you can do that for surety bonds, there's no reason why we cannot do that for engineering, for property, for marine, for life and health, etc. And that, again, is an effect and an impact of a company and companies working together in implementing the principles. The Chief Risk Officers Forum. They are a group of chief risk officers from insurance companies around the world whose basic role is to deploy best risk management in the insurance industry. And they themselves have also acknowledged the importance of the principles for chief risk officers around the world. South Africa. Based on the principles, the South African Insurance Association created an environmental, social, and governance framework on what are the most material issues for the South African insurance industry in this context. And I'm very happy to say that in Latin America, we have not seen an innovation like what the Brazilians have done. Through the leadership of PSI signatories in Brazil and Brazilian Insurance Confederation, who's here represented by Maria Elena, they have done something that we have not seen in any market. Based on the 4 principles, the Brazilian market came up with 4 goals on how their industry can achieve the aims of the principles. That would not have happened without a strong adoption by the association and by different companies in Brazil on what the principles mean for their market. And the PSI, it is housed within the UN Environment Program, but it's an initiative that cuts across that we would like to share with the entire UN system. So I'm quite happy that Juan Pablo is here. I'm also talking to his colleague in Egypt about the PSI. We are talking to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, the World Health Organization. And in fact, when I come back to Geneva on Thursday, we will have a UN system meeting on how insurance companies and the UN can support the climate resilience initiative of the Secretary General that I will speak about soon. So what else have we done? This year is a big year. In Sendai, Japan, in March, there was a World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction. It's a new framework for the global community on what governments and stakeholders around the world can do to reduce disasters worldwide. And in Japan, we launched the United for Disaster Resilience Statement that was crafted by the PSI. And what was the message here? The message from the insurance industry was that within that global framework from 2015 to 2030 on disaster risk reduction, we have identified our role as risk managers, as risk carriers, and as investors in helping build disaster resilient communities and economies. And I have to tell you, within the business sector, it was the insurance industry which showed leadership in Sendai. What else has happened? Last year we were in London and we were with the group CEO of Aviva. And he was hosting us for a PSI event in London, similar to something like this that we have right now in Colombia. And in that event, he launched Aviva's roadmap to sustainable capital markets. In that roadmap, it clearly shows how institutional investors like insurance companies and pension funds can actually support the sustainable development through the way they manage and allocate capital. What has happened? 1 year after, we have the CEO of Aviva talking to the UN General Assembly in New York about how the insurance industry and the financial community can support the sustainable development goals. It's a very exciting moment when you have an insurance company talking in front of the General Assembly how it can support the goals. So, and then we still have the climate change conference in Paris. So this moment that we have right now, from Sendai in Addis Ababa, we also had the Financing for Development Conference, and then the Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted in New York, and we're hoping to achieve a universal climate change agreement in Paris. So the moment that we have right now is very exciting for the global community, not only for governments, but also for business. And in that context, the PSI also said, the insurance companies within the PSI said, how can we manifest our support for these global objectives? So the PSI now has created a global platform where we can accept voluntary commitments from companies and associations around the world on how they can support these global policy frameworks on sustainable development. What else have we done? Last year to this year, we went around the world to understand how insurance policy and regulation around the world can also be part of the agenda in promoting sustainable development. We were in California, the Philippines, we also were in Rio, and we also learned a lot of things along the way. One of the very interesting country experiences that I had was in China. In China, the whole government has a vision of an ecological civilization. And they realize that if we are to achieve that vision as a country, we cannot achieve that without a financial system that supports a green economy. And when they looked at the financial system, we said, we need to do something about credit. We need to have green credit, green insurance, green bonds, green investments to make that vision true. So the China right now is undergoing an overhaul of the financial system on how they can have a financial system that will support sustainable development, particularly the environmental dimension of sustainable development. I was quite happy to be part of a working group. They have come back to us and said, we want to do more about green bonds, green insurance. So I'm going to be sharing more of that, hopefully, to more people on what we've learned in China. And then we ended up at Swiss Re. At Swiss Re, we had Achim Steyer, the head of UNEP, the Christiana Figueres, the UN's top climate change official. We had the Insurance Commissioner of California. We had the G7. We had insurance companies and insurance regulators around the world coming together to discuss how can we harness the full potential of the insurance industry for sustainable development. And what did we learn? We learned through that global consultation, through that roundtable at Swiss Re, that if you look at the insurance industry and sustainable development, you need to look at different dimensions. One dimension is the dimension of risk. How does the insurance industry manage issues and risk like climate? The other dimension is access. Access to insurance, access to financial services, and innovations, for example, like index-based insurance, are important elements for the insurance industry. And there is the third dimension of investment, how insurers as investors can drive sustainable development also through their investments. But there is also another set of dimensions. Corporate action is one thing. You can do something as a company, but that is only corporate commitment, and that's important. But there can be something that can be done around that. We've seen around the world that partnerships are important for the insurance industry. The case of Australia I mentioned earlier is not only a pure insurance experience. It was an insurer working with a bank, with a property developer, with a reinsurer, and with a civil society organization. And then there is also the level of policy and regulation in terms of driving this agenda forward as well. And what are the three things that we thought would be helpful? We believe that the insurance industry should come together globally and foster an insurance network for sustainable development. We hope in the PSI that we can strongly position the PSI to be this insurance network for sustainable development. We hope the microinsurance network will also join us, aside from other initiatives out there, and really make the PSI a very strong global network for sustainable development. We also believe that regulators should come into the picture and be part of this agenda, because if regulators are unaware of what sustainable development issues are, then it's also a very challenging experience to communicate to them what the market and what companies are trying to do. And finally, one of the big things that we're thinking about is that whatever those sustainable development goals are, if we want to translate them for insurance practitioners, one powerful idea is, can we have a set of insurance development goals that would directly support the 17 sustainable development goals that Juan Pablo had clearly explained earlier. And in terms of insurance policy and regulation, just last month, the Prudential Regulation Authority of the Bank of England came up with a report showing how climate change is a material issue for the UK insurance industry, not only in terms of physical risks, but also liability risks, and also the transition risks to a lower carbon economy. And in fact, that report also recognized the leadership by UK insurance companies, and they have cited the principles for sustainable insurance as a manifestation of leadership by insurance companies in the UK in addressing the issue of climate change. That is from the world's third largest insurance market, the Bank of England not only regulates the UK insurance industry, the governor, Mark Carney, is also the chairman of the Financial Stability Board. And then finally, a few other thoughts. The Secretary General at the Climate Change Conference in Paris this year will launch a global climate resilience initiative. This initiative will be supported by UN agencies around the world. It will have 3 pillars. How do you anticipate climate risk? How can you address issues like early warning systems for vulnerable countries? There is a pillar for absorbing climate risk, and that is really an insurance agenda. But it's not only insurance, because for the bottom of the pyramid, they cannot afford insurance. So they also want to enhance social protection packages for really the most vulnerable. And then they also want to make sure that development through the financial system is climate resilient. So I've been in discussions with the Office of the Secretary General on what can governments do, what can business do, what can civil society organizations do. And in the area of business, the strongest one that has been identified is the role of the insurance industry. So, these goals I don't need to explain. They were already crafted there. But I think the message is simple. The smart companies and smart organizations would align themselves to this global compass for development for the next 15 years. This is something that has been adopted by governments around the world. It's applicable to everyone. If you are an insurance company, your stakeholders hopefully will increasingly ask, what are you doing to support these goals? And the good thing is that there are many things that we're seeing out there that's being done by insurance companies. As risk managers, look at the expertise in catastrophe risk modeling, the literacy programs on health and insurance, programs that help disaster awareness and preparedness in communities. You have insurance as a financial instrument for low-income people, for low-carbon technologies, and you also have investments in resilient infrastructure, in sustainable agriculture and forestry, etc. These are things that many companies around the world are doing, but they're not enough. So the question is, how can we scale those, replicate those, and make it normal, routine practice? So 3 years ago, we were in Rio de Janeiro to launch these principles. And the PSI crafted this vision for the initiative. That vision says, a risk-aware world where the insurance industry is trusted and plays its full role in enabling a healthy, safe, resilient, and sustainable society. I think by having this event today, by Fasicolda signing the PSI, and we hope that individual companies too, I think we're making a statement here today. The Colombian insurance industry is making a statement that you support that vision, that you want to shape your role in sustainable development, and that you can do it here in Colombia as well. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time, and I'm happy to answer any questions.